Y es hora entonces de dar paso a las exposiciones de nuestros invitados internacionales en este seminario. Pero antes, aunque son mundialmente conocidos, quisiera hacer una breve reseña de ellos. Como ustedes saben, el profesor Michael Porter es considerado como el padre de la estrategia competitiva y uno de los referentes del management a nivel mundial. Académico, como se ha dicho, de la Universidad de Harvard, sus ideas han influenciado a decenas de países. En 2001, la Escuela de Negocios de Harvard y la University crearon en conjunto el Institute for Strategy and Competitiveness, dedicados a difundir el trabajo del profesor Porter. Es autor de 18 libros y más de 125 artículos de difusión global. Ha recibido una enorme lista de reconocimientos por su destacada carrera académica y ha sido además consultor de las más importantes compañías como Caterpillar, DuPont, Procter & Gamble, Royal Dutch Shell, entre muchas otras. Su libro, La ventaja competitiva de las naciones, es un clásico que se enseña en las escuelas de negocios de todo el mundo y que ha guiado la política económica, además de muchos países. En los últimos años, el profesor Porter ha dedicado creciente atención en sus investigaciones a la filantropía y al rol de las corporaciones en la sociedad. Su artículo en conjunto con Mark Kramer en el Harvard Business Review, titulado La nueva agenda de la filantropía, creando valor, ha introducido un nuevo modelo para desarrollar estrategias en las fundaciones y otras organizaciones de este tipo. Sin más preámbulos, entonces, quisiera dejar con todos ustedes al profesor Michael Porter. Profesor, por favor.
And what I'd like to do this morning is really do two things. First of all, I'd like to talk about competitiveness, because I think that despite the progress that Chile has made as a country, competitiveness remains really the central fundamental challenge. And although the country's made progress, there's a long way to go. The country is far from an advanced economy at this stage. There's far too much inequality. Incomes are still medium. And despite the remarkable leadership that Chile has offered in terms of government and in terms of opening, in terms of embracing free market principles, there's lots of work to be done. So I'd like to talk a lot about competitiveness, because I think it's very important at this particular moment that we understand very clearly what that means. So I'd like to talk about competitiveness, and I'd like to share with you some of our latest learning on this subject from working around the world. And then I'd like to do something I probably shouldn't do. And that is, I'd like to try to give you a bit of a scorecard of how Chile's doing right now. And I shouldn't do this because no good will come of it. I'll just get a lot of criticism. It always happens. But I think it's important for you to know what an outsider sees when he looks at this country and where you are in your economic trajectory. And then I'd like to conclude by saying that I think the missing link right now in Chile is a strategy. I don't think Chile has a strategy. I think the country has some goals. You want to be a developed country. Great. You want to eliminate poverty. Great. You have some very ambitious goals. There's a lot of policies being improved right now. The minister and his team that we just heard from are marvelous. And they're doing great work. And they're working on all kinds of specific policies. And every time I talk to another member of the government, there's more policies that they're working on. Dozens and dozens and dozens of policies. But we have a gap between the goals and all these little policies. And that gap is a strategy. What's the strategic position of Chile going to be? What is the competitive advantage of Chile? What shape could its economy take over the next 5 or 10 or 20 years? We can't just be debating these little issues politically and having little fights about this policy and this policy. This country needs a strategy. And that whole notion of strategy is a little uncomfortable in Chile, because in Chile you have embraced free market principles. That's great. But sometimes free market principles get misinterpreted as meaning you just stand back and laissez-faire. Let the market work. But that's not the way countries get great. They get great by having a coherent, concerted vision where business and government and labor and other aspects of society have an understanding of where the country has to go, what problems have to be addressed. And I think Chile at this moment, in a way, lacks a strategy. I'm not trying to be critical. I think the country has an excellent government. I think a lot of progress is being made. I think a lot of the right steps are being taken. But I'd like to suggest at the end that we step back and think a little bit more broadly and strategically about the country. And then we can look at individual policy improvements in a bigger context. And then we won't have little debates anymore. We'll have big debates and discussions about the direction. And I believe that if we can kind of elevate this discussion to a higher level in Chile, you'll make a lot more progress. Right now, in a way, the Chilean economy is stuck. You've done about as much as you can do with the current model. And now, as we've heard already this morning, we have to jump to a new model. We know that innovation is going to be part of that model. We know that more skill is going to be part of that model. But the question is kind of what's that path, given where we're starting today? Given that, thankfully, growth has resumed. Given that, thankfully, the country is creating jobs again, now what's the path we need to be on? So let's begin and talk about competitiveness, and I'm not quite sure, there we go, I think we'll start there. I could go on all day on this topic, and unfortunately I don't have all day, and we need to really hear from Jim anyway. So let me start in really the middle of my presentation and just sort of summarize the way I see the economic situation facing this country roughly today. Again, I want to apologize for any, I'm not a deep expert on the country and all the economic statistics, but I want to give you at least an outsider's impression of the country. First of all, I think this country has done a marvelous job of managing through the global economic crisis. The macroeconomic policies are excellent. The country has done a good job on the big issues of eliminating corruption and having an effective government that's transparent. And that's been a tremendous asset. And that's why the country has bounced back so quickly. The country still is outperforming many of its Latin American peers. But I think, as we'll see later, if you compare yourself to your neighbors, you look relatively good. If you compare yourself to who you want to be, you don't look good. And, it's like, what league are you playing in? In baseball in America, we have the single A, and then we have double A, and then we have triple A, and then we have the major league. And compared in the minor league, you look pretty good. You look pretty good compared to some of the neighbors. But boy, compared to those countries that you aspire to be, and you have every right to aspire to be, performance is only so-so. Prosperity growth remains respectable. Poverty's been going down. All those things are good. One of the most exciting things that's happened recently in Chile is you've started to create jobs. After sort of a very depressing period of not creating jobs. And those jobs are better and better. They're salary jobs. They're not just self-employment. There's good signs. Women are starting to move into the workforce in Chile in greater numbers. That's a very, very good sign. So this is a tremendous thing to be optimistic and encouraged about. And I think this progress is a reflection of the sound, particularly macroeconomic policies, the quality of government in terms of the talent in government in this country, the confidence that has been rebuilding in the country. All these things, and I should also say the rebuilding of the country because of the earthquake isn't hurting in terms of economic growth. But all these things are good. And yet, I don't believe that we should be satisfied. Because there has been a relative slowdown in growth. Yes, it's picked up recently. Whether it stays at current levels for year after year after year is an open question, but I think if we actually look realistically, there's been a bit of a slowdown, particularly compared to some of our peers. Inequality remains stubbornly high in this country in terms of the differences of income. The most scariest thing about Chile is that productivity growth has stagnated. We'll talk a lot about productivity. Productivity is the fundamental, most important thing that determines economic success, with no close second. If you want to be prosperous, you have to be productive. Productive is when you can generate a lot of output in a day of work. Productivity growth has stagnated. And to the extent that you're growing productivity, it's based mostly on capital investment, not on innovation. And we found that kind of the traditional ways of growing productivity, migrating labor out of less productive sectors into more productive sectors, has slowed down. And this is the bottleneck. Productivity is the bottleneck facing the Chilean economy. We just have to become more productive. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on. Export growth, which is a sign that we are truly competitive in the international markets, is disappointing. You know, Chile has exports, but if you remove the effect of resource price increases, you don't see much real export growth. You don't see much real export diversification in the economy. Innovation output, and this is one of the reasons why we're having this session today, is very, very weak. It's remarkable. There's a lot of smart people in Chile. There's a lot of good engineers in Chile. There's a lot of people that have first-class training and expertise. There's a lot of Chileans that are very tuned in to the global economy, the knowledge economy, very international, very cosmopolitan. Why isn't there more innovation here? What's wrong? Because we know that that is the key to moving up the ladder in terms of prosperity and economic growth. And I think what's happened in Chile is kind of the traditional strengths in macroeconomic policy and openness have been great. They've given us a great run here, combined with the natural resource endowments of the country. But this kind of model is sort of playing itself out. And now the question is where do we go from here? And this is an uncomfortable moment for people in the Chilean government, at least from my perspective, because there's a very strong view in Chile that really that government's role is to stay out of the economy. And government's role is perhaps to provide some incentives. But otherwise, you know, government shouldn't be too involved. But yet we have some fundamental things that have to get done in Chile in terms of building technological resources, training the people, and others that are almost inherently heavily based on effective government, playing a more positive role, not just getting out, but playing a more positive role. And in some ways, I think the Chilean government is struggling with this new role. Very good at the traditional roles. We need to preserve those, but struggling with this new role. in a way, I think we're trapped a little bit in the concept of laissez-faire. And I think that's being misinterpreted. Government should stay out of some things, but government has to be involved in others to create certain public assets, to make things happen. And this is an interesting, complicated moment. Now, in most countries, you have the opposite problem. In most countries, government's been much too involved and much too interventionist and much too distorting of the economy, and the challenge is to get them out. In Chile, the ideology has been, no, government needs to, stay away. We have raging debates. I have raging debates with people in government in Chile about clusters. We'll talk about clusters later on. What the role of government in clusters is. We'll talk about that. So I'm just trying to give you a sort of this gestalt of, I think, where the philosophy, the thinking is right now, and how we need to kind of forge a new kind of understanding of what a free market economy looks like. And it doesn't mean that government doesn't do anything. Just stands back. It doesn't mean that. But we have to figure out what it does mean, and that's a challenge. So let's talk a little bit about competitiveness. I'll try to go quickly because I'm assuming that many of you are familiar with these basic concepts. But I think it's very important that we all get on the same page here, because ultimately it's reaching kind of a consensus about what it will take to move the country forward that will allow the country to move forward. If we don't have a consensus, if we're all fighting about what we need to do, then we're going to fight on every single policy step. And it's going to be ugly. And we've got a government here that's not the president's party does not control the legislature. So we're going to have a dialogue about everything. So the question is, how can we have a dialogue that moves us forward more quickly? So competitiveness, as I said a minute ago, is defined as productivity. That's the only sensible way to think about competitiveness. Competitiveness is the productivity with which a nation utilizes its resources, its labor, its capital, and its natural endowments. If you're productive, that means you can generate a lot of value for the resource. The worker can produce a lot in a day, a lot of value in a day, because they're skilled, because they're using good technology, because they're efficient. Productivity determines prosperity. If you're productive, you can earn a high wage. If you're not productive, you must live on a low wage. Productivity is the central driving source of prosperity. Everything you do must be tested against productivity. Is this policy productive? Is this practice productive? Does it encourage productivity? That's the question we always have to ask in everything we do, in any country. And there's no doubt about this. The data about what's associated with prosperity growth is very, very clear. We know this. Now, productivity, we find, does not depend on what you do. Productivity depends on how you do it. To be highly productive, you can be highly productive in agriculture. You can be highly productive in making shoes. You can be highly productive in making airplanes. You can be productive doing almost anything if you have the level of skill, if you have the level of technology, if you have the level of efficiency. And what we find is that there's not good or bad industries in the economy. That's not the right way to think about productivity growth. The right way to think about it is we need to make whatever we do more productive. And then what we find is that new industries emerge out of traditional industries. Things don't just pop up out of nothing. Countries evolve and improve their productivity by migrating expertise and skill from one field to a related field to a related field. I'll show you some charts about that later on. And we can't get hung up on thinking that we need to become Silicon Valley. It'd be great if we could be Silicon Valley in Chile. But we're not going to get to Silicon Valley anytime soon, in my opinion. Because we have to build assets first, and those assets are going to take a long time to build. We're not going to innovate probably in IT in Chile, unless I'm misunderstanding, because we don't have enough of the assets to move in that area. So what we're going to need to do is start our innovation and our productivity growth process from where we are and really build on that strength. We can be productive, much more productive in all the fields in which Chile today competes. And that process of becoming more productive in what we do today is going to allow us to get into new things and new things and new things and new things. That's how economies grow. That's how economies innovate. You know, let's take Japan. You know, Japan is now a world power in many kinds of consumer electronics and robotics and things like that. Well, they didn't start there. They started with black and white television sets 40 years ago. And then they moved to color television sets, and then they moved to VCRs, and then they moved to this. And economic development is a process of building strengths, building capabilities, building expertise, building skills, building a critical mass of companies in a given field. We've got to think about the process of economic development that way. It's not about being in biotech. It doesn't matter if you're in biotech. That's not going to determine your success, whether you're in biotech or not. What's going to determine your success is whether you can be relentlessly driving productivity, getting more innovative and high-skilled at whatever and anything you can do. That's the challenge of competitiveness. And that, in the modern global economy, is going to require a blending of foreign firms and Chilean firms. Chile has to be open. We need the best firms in the world to come here and teach us how to be productive, connect us better to international markets. But we also need Chilean firms to grow up and be part of those clusters that we build. And so we've got to create an economic strategy that really welcomes and celebrates that synthesis, that blending of both foreign and local. Okay. Now the question is, how do we create productivity? What does it take? What are the ingredients? And there, the work that we've been doing at Harvard, at my institute, has kind of taken a number of some big steps in trying to define and understand the productivity model at the national level. And the way we think about productivity now, and the way we think about competitiveness, and the way we try to understand and assess competitiveness at the national level looks something like this. That really at the foundation of any economy and its ultimate success are endowments. Endowments are things like natural resources, of course. Endowments are things like a location in the world. You inherit a location in the world. And location includes not only how far are you from markets, and the answer for Chile is pretty far, but endowment also includes, location includes such things like, are you located efficiently like on the ocean? Because that makes logistics easier for you than a country that would be, for example, landlocked. So location is an endowment. Just the sheer number of citizens, the people, the population is an endowment. Every country has an endowment. And some of those endowments translate directly into prosperity. If you have copper and you can mine it, you can sell it. And that creates a certain amount of prosperity. And so endowments affect prosperity. But what we found over and over again is the endowment itself is not what makes you prosperous. It's how you use the endowment. It's how you deploy the endowment. It's how effectively and efficiently and productive the labor you have is. It's not the location itself. It's whether you can capitalize on the location to make you competitive in terms of particular fields. It's not the natural resources, but it's the efficiency, effectiveness with which you can deploy those resources, utilize those resources, and in some cases, add value to those resources that determines your ultimate prosperity. So that means that we need these two additional levels. We have sort of the endowment level, but then the next level is what we like to call macroeconomic competitiveness.